And we're continuing the conversation. Welcome back to The Truth of the Matter. I'm Natasha Zouves. We are shining a light on a dark chapter of American history, and one that's largely unknown. During the Cold War, in the name of preparing for the Soviet threat, the U.S. government conducting human experiments on its own people without their knowledge or their consent. In part one of our conversation with Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor, which is already posted, you can take a look, she described children, some of them orphans, being fed radioactive oatmeal. They were told they were joining a science club, promised a quart of milk a day, a trip to the beach, and years later they testified about the after effects, reporting lumps on my arms, my stomach. Pregnant women in Tennessee and California were given a radioactive cocktail at top universities to see how it crossed the placenta to their unborn babies, some later suffering miscarriages, illness, and cancer. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented government experiments. And we're continuing to ask the question, what were they doing in St. Louis? You may remember I went on the ground as residents told me about a mysterious fog sprayed through their neighborhood when they were kids, a fog that clung to their skin and settled over thousands of Americans who lived there. The U.S. Army now admits they sprayed a chemical containing cadmium, a known carcinogen, but they do not admit harm. Residents tell me they've been getting sick, some of them with rare cancers, and they're asking, was there anything else in that spray? We're going to play our investigation now so you can listen for yourself to what was uncovered, and then right on the other side, part two of our conversation with Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor. The fog drifted through the streets like a ghost.
That's exactly what it looked like, a thick fog.
It was summertime and it was hot. We would just run through it as fast as we could and try to just cool ourselves off. It stuck to you.
The spray was so foul as far as the odor. It made some of us have headaches, nausea, dizziness.
That's what I remember. It made me sick.
It wasn't the weather. It was an eerie smoke descending from rooftops, rolling from the backs of trucks.
Regular flatbed truck, but it had a big machine on the back. And it had a big nozzle that really sprayed a fog you couldn't even see through. It was that thick. And it really, we felt it as it would adhere to our skin. And as far as the guys on top of the buildings, they tried to portray them to us as maintenance workers. But we was like, what is a maintenance worker doing? And basically a hazmat suit. And they had masks and goggles.
In the 1950s and 60s, in secret, the U.S. Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide into the air of a St. Louis housing project, a largely black neighborhood called Pruitt-Igoe.
It was a lose-lose situation for us in Pruitt-Igoe. We were subjects.
They didn't ask for our permission. We didn't ask for them to spray us. My government used me like I was a guinea pig.
We're standing at where Pruitt-Igoe used to be here in St. Louis, and it's hard to believe more than 10,000 people used to live here. As we bring our drone up, you can see it's mostly just an empty lot now, overgrown with trees. This used to be filled with 33 high-rise buildings. It was all demolished in 1976. And according to the National Research Council, St. Louis was chosen for spraying experiments because it had similar characteristics to Soviet targets like Moscow in terms of population density and terrain and proximity to a river. The government now admits to a secretive series of Cold War tests, including one dubbed large area coverage. More than 30 tests conducted across the U.S. and Canada, spraying zinc cadmium sulfide from planes, rooftops, and vehicles to simulate how a biological attack might spread, all to prepare for potential warfare against the Soviets.
Many of us been in the military and had top secret clearances. We know how it works.
We have died for America. We have fought for America.
You are a veteran.
I am United States Air Force veteran.
Dr. Starks, you're a veteran as well,
Yes, I am. I'm an Air Force veteran also.
Is there a sense of betrayal here?
Definitely.
They want to know if those secret tests have anything to do with what they're observing with their own eyes.
I lost my two older siblings to cancer. I lost a brother last month.
I've been diagnosed recently with a rare form of lymphoma.
I had cancer of the left kidney, had partial removal of my left kidney.
NewsNation reached out to the Army for answers. They provided a one-page response. It says the Army's own Center for Health Promotion and Preventive Medicine investigated in 1994 and found inhalation exposure would not pose a health risk. They also cite later corroborating reviews, including a 1997 review by the National Research Council. Perhaps they assumed we wouldn't read the NRC's 380-page report, but we did, and the Army's statement doesn't show the full picture. In that 1997 review, the National Research Council explicitly says repeated exposure to zinc cadmium sulfide can cause kidney or bone toxicity or lung cancer if levels are high enough. And they admitted they couldn't fully assess the risk. Why? Because some Army records remain classified, it says, for national security reasons. More troubling, key Army exposure records were missing, and when the NRC asked the Army to supply them, the Army said it couldn't find them. Finally, the NRC considered conducting its own study, but concluded it wasn't feasible. In short, it did not test the site, collect samples, or test residents, and they didn't have access to all the data. Their review was based on what the Army gave them, and what the Army either could not find or withheld. The Army ends its statement to NewsNation by saying, quote, "None of the reports contained evidence of a radioactive component to the zinc-cadmium sulfide dispersion tests. Residents say the secrecy and delays are no accident."
They're waiting us out.
They're waiting on all of us to die.
We're on our way to meet with a researcher right now who has dedicated her career, decades, to declassifying documents and trying to figure out what exactly happened here in the city of St. Louis and what exactly was in that spray. Across the country, the government conducted secret Cold War experiments in plain sight.
It was so secretive that we're really just now sort of digging out from underneath this to try to understand the scale of it.
And Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor helped uncover many of them.
We know that they were giving radioactive cocktails to pregnant women. We know that they were feeding radioactive oatmeal to children in state schools. They've admitted to those things, and they won't release the material related to St. Louis.
It's true. American children in state-run institutions like the Fernald School were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of studies by MIT sponsored by the Atomic Energy Commission. You can see some of the documents Dr. Martino-Taylor worked to gather and declassify on MIT letterhead describing experiments on human subjects. The children, some of them orphans, were told they'd be joining a science club. They were promised a quart of milk a day, a trip to a baseball game, to the beach. A copy of the 1994 congressional hearing shows those children, now grown, describing being told the oatmeal was just vitamins and recalling the health problems that followed: lumps on my arms, my stomach. Pregnant women were also unknowingly given radioactive iron at top hospitals in Tennessee and California to study how radiation crossed the placenta, some later reporting miscarriages, illness, or birth defects. A class action lawsuit resulted in a settlement in the 90s.
Do you believe the U.S. government sprayed some kind of radioactive material on the residents of St. Louis?
I believe that they did. There's so much contextual evidence that points that way, and I spent years looking at this.
She says her research reveals the men who designed and oversaw the St. Louis experiments were some of the top experts in radioactive weapons.
We know that the people who designed the study, who oversaw the study, these were all the radiological weapons experts who were looking at open-air radiological weapons.
One of them, Brigadier General William Creasy, was head of the Army Chemical Corps, the very branch leading America's secret radiological weapons program during the Cold War. He brought in a scientist named Philip Layton, who was the Army's leading authority on using radioactive particles in aerosol form, fog-like clouds designed to drift over enemy terrain.
So the very man who designed this spraying experiment in St. Louis was an expert in using radioactive fog against the enemy.
Yes, he was the expert.
Then she says there's the timing.
They were looking for a city to test their offensive weapons program. They wanted to do it. They expressed this in documents. St. Louis was their chosen city. That was their analog city to Moscow. And they wanted to do this in 1953. They showed up in 1953 in St. Louis.
But there's one document Dr. Martino-Taylor has never been able to unearth. It's still classified. The Joint Quarterly Reports detail the spraying experiments, all written by Layton himself. The last one is missing. It's called Joint Quarterly Report 5, and we tried to get it. Our team filed a Freedom of Information Act request on May 5th of 2025. By law, the government must respond to a FOIA within 20 working days, but it's been more than 3 months. With multiple follow-ups, nothing. The silence is what's called a constructive denial, and renowned activist Erin Brockovich says it reminds her of cases where the truth was hidden. So, Erin, what is your reaction to this NewsNation investigation? Did this shock even you?
Absolutely. I think my comment was, are we WTF the kidding me? I mean, what the hell? It's awful. I mean, the biggest thing, and I've learned in 30 years, is it's always the cover up that enrages people, that hurts people. And I've learned that communities can handle the truth. What they don't handle and where they'll tip a scale is the lie. So this has been a cover up, and I think that modern day agencies owe it to them. The truth.
Do you think there's been a lie here, a cover-up here?
It sure looks that way.
Our investigation now drawing attention from lawmakers, including Congressman Wesley Bell of Missouri.
When American citizens have been impacted and exposed to chemicals specifically because of the federal government, I think that we should do, as Democrats and Republicans, we should all do the right thing, make certain to make these folks whole again, get them the compensation they deserve and the treatment that they need and also deserve.
It can happen to you. Don't get duped that it can't happen to you. We didn't think it was gonna happen to us. We was babies, kids. It can happen to you too.
Representative Bell is now fighting to get Pruitt-Igoe included in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that would provide payouts to Americans who can prove they were exposed to radiation during the Cold War. But for Pruitt-Igoe residents, there's a catch. Because key records remain classified, they haven't been able to prove what they were exposed to.
What do you want everyone to know about what happened here?
The truth. Whatever the truth is, we want to know the truth. I don't think we get that now.
In the meantime, residents say all they can do is wait, hoping someone finally listens.
When will you give up this fight?
Never. Till I'm cold and dead and buried in my grave.
We want to bring back in Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor on this. She is the author of Behind the Fog, How the U.S. Cold War Radiological Weapons Program Exposed Innocent Americans. I want to talk more about how you even got into this research in St. Louis, because it's a fascinating story. How did you get tipped off initially, and what was your reaction when you first heard about it?
I didn't know anything about this, but someone approached me at work and said, that she had recently had breast cancer. I knew this about her, and she said that she was concerned that her breast cancer diagnosis was somehow connected to something that had happened to her when she was young, and in school. And I, said, "Well, tell me more about that." She said that when she was in elementary school, I believe it was, that she had been sprayed when she was on the playground at school. And that she believed that it was some sort of Army-connected experiment or test or something. And I don't even think I put this in the book, but she said that she had some memory of someone holding a wand up against her and measuring somehow something that was going on. And this was something that kept coming back after her diagnosis. She kept wondering, is this connected to, my health? And so I said, well, I have never heard of this. I'm not saying that I doubt you, but I have never heard anything about this happening in St. Louis or anywhere. And she said, well, is this something that you might be willing to look at? Because she knew that, I was a researcher and, looked at things like this. And I said, well, sure, I'm happy to help you however I can. And I looked into it, and
all I found at first was just this news article that reported that some spraying had occurred in St. Louis, but it didn't give any specifics, no details. And so I thought, well, that's not enough for me to, to do much with. So I dug a little bit more, ran out of time, as we do, busy people at work, and I didn't find anything else. And I went to her and I said, I'm so sorry, but I did find one article about this. So this certainly could be something that occurred, but I'm just not finding anything about, kids or playgrounds or, specifics about this. So I'm sorry, but I can't be of much help. She thanked me very graciously, and that was that. About a week later, something like a week, there was a knock on my front door. I was just home from work, dinner time, busy, and it was my next door neighbor, who I didn't know very well, but she did know also what my job was, that I did research. And she said, I have a question for you. It's kind of going to sound like it's, crazy, but, when I was a kid, I was sprayed on the playground at school, and I had a brain tumor 10 years ago, and it has always bothered me, that this could be connected. And she said she had recovered from her brain tumor, and had lived through this really terrible time. But these two people do not know each other, but they're both approaching me with the same story that just seems so difficult to believe. And so at this point, it was really a red flag to me. Like, okay, both of these people seem very, reasonable, rational, responsible people. And, I didn't know what to think of that. I really had my doubts, but now it was becoming very real.
Yeah, so you
So
entered this
yeah,
with a lot of healthy skepticism. Your
I
researcher's
did.
mind when you first heard about this.
I did. I had a lot of doubt. I thought, something happened in St. Louis. I don't know what it was, because clearly there was this news report about it. But I don't see anything about children. I don't see anything about people. I don't see anything about anyone being sort of swept up in that or involved in that. And so I thought, okay, well, it seems doubtful to me.
Yeah.
But when the second person came to me, suddenly it really just sort of opened something up. Like, why would they have the same sort of memory, and they don't know each other? They've never met. The only thing in common that they have is me as a researcher, and this question. And so it really made me pause and think, I wonder, I wonder what happened here. So when it was time to select a topic for my dissertation, I was actually, one evening, I was missing class, and I had the flu really bad. And so I was laying on the couch. I was sort of drifting in and out of, how you are when you have the flu. I was just sort of drifting in and out of sleep. And I opened my
Yeah.
eyes, and on PBS, there was a video, a documentary was airing, and it showed a plane flying over communities, spraying communities. And it jolted me up, and I thought those women had those questions. I need to answer those questions. I need to see what I can find out. So I selected that as my dissertation topic. I went to my dissertation advisor and said, I've got this really unbelievable story, and I really need to figure it out because it's been nagging at me. And I was just reminded of it yesterday. And I really have to follow this up.
Wow.
By the way, I'd written my master's thesis about chemical weapons. So I was, pretty aware of what I was digging into. It wasn't blindly going into this. But it didn't make sense after a while, and I kept hitting dead ends. So that's when the radiological weapons program started revealing itself, and it was slow. I would go to my dissertation advisor and say, I found like uh, 2 cases where, people were injected with radioactive material, and I'm not sure how to make sense of that. And then the next week I would go to him and say, I found 7 cases now, and this is just startling. This is disturbing. I don't know what to make of this. And I kept finding case after case, and it was 30 cases, and then it was more, and it just really unraveled itself in front of me.
Mm. And I want to ask, I know that the experience for me when I'm putting together or working on an investigation, and sometimes these investigations take 6 months, a year and a half, it is a very visceral experience for me. I feel it like a humming in my chest, like a roiling in my gut. It wakes me up at 3 a.m. These people's stories and the work that needs to be done. What was the experience like for you in those almost 2 decades of uncovering 5 cases and then 30 cases of injecting radioactive material and then seeing the 4 prongs of this, as you say, and wondering how big was this? How secretive was this? What was actually going on here?
My workday started at 4 a.m. It's dark at 4 a.m. And so I was often working sort of in my dark office, lights on, but darkness around me. And it seemed, it was so solemn and it seemed so appropriate to the topic. It, a sort of a lonely, solemn, middle of the night research project. Nothing that would allow you to ever really sleep deeply. There were moments where I thought, do I have the fortitude to go on with this?
Yeah.
And I'm a strong person, but I really did wonder, do I have the fortitude to continue this research? But every time I would read another, set of experiments, or I would think about, the people in St. Louis, or I would think about the children in Massachusetts, or I would think about these people who have endured so much and had so much on their shoulders. You know what? I can do the research for them. This is the easy part in many regards, and that they deserve to have an explanation. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve to be able to pursue justice. And I do very, rigorously believe in those things. And so, in the middle of the night, that often was sometimes the only thing that was driving me, but that drove me.
I really appreciate you sharing that with me. Thank you. Let's talk about what you uncovered in St. Louis. Let's talk about the basic facts first. Where was this done? Who is doing this? How many people were sprayed, and over what period of time?
So there were spray experiments that began in 1953. Early 1953, January 1953, and continued on through mid 1954. But I want to add that other entities came back in the 1960s and began spraying again 1963 through 1965. So there were 2 different spray events that took place. The first one involved, by design, it was by the Army Chemical Corps. Philip Layton was a scientist who was also an officer, high-ranking officer, who was an expert in radioactive clouds, essentially airborne radiation. And he was the expert for that. And so they certainly wanted him to be on board for any of their most important experiments. St. Louis, and in fact, I need to add here that it was probably seeing his role and who he was and what his expertise were that really alerted me early on to this is not just, some strange, clearing out machines or whatever you might think that they were doing in St. Louis, that this was a very carefully coordinated, calculated series of experiments that took place over a long period of time in a very populated area. In fact, the Army referred to St. Louis as a densely populated slum area. Those were the Army's words for this area of St. Louis. Now, what does that mean to the Army, right? That means something to them. The fact that they are saying that in their documents, that means something to that. So what meaning does that hold for them? Does that mean, and I suspect that it does that mean that this is a vulnerable population that lacks the resources to be able to challenge what was happening in the area and in the community around them? That, because of this lack of resources, was, which certainly was the case, that they had less safeguards than what might occur in a different community, maybe in the county area, for example. And so there are certain things that to me said that this was a very perhaps even more egregious than some of the other experiments. And I don't want to rank, or categorize anything, but in some ways, that's the case. And if we look at, you had mentioned Protego, that was mostly children that lived in that location, but there were other housing complexes around that, and there were other houses around that also were, experienced that exposure by the Army Chemical Corps.
And this is so interesting because all the Army admits to even today is spraying zinc cadmium sulfide in this area during those years on this neighborhood. That is all. They do not admit to any radioactive component to that spray. At the very least, zinc cadmium sulfide contains cadmium, which is a known carcinogen. And these residents still tell me that they do not believe any long-term health studies have been done. And they wonder if their health issues, they've buried many loved ones, their parents suffering from cancers, strange illnesses in their siblings, their friends, illnesses that they've developed themselves, have anything to do with that spraying. How does your research complicate the Army's claim that it was just zinc cadmium sulfide and that they believe that zinc cadmium sulfide was harmless? And also tell us about that moment you say again when you see Philip Layton's involvement and an antenna in your researcher's mind goes up and says, why is this man, who is an expert in radiological fog against the enemy, why is he the one who is involved in this study and this study design? It's a big question, but if you could help lead us through that, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Yes. Absolutely. Philip Layton's involvement, not just his involvement, he designed the study, right? I mean, he was really in charge of the study, and he was an Army colonel. I mean, he was, a big part of the military structure in terms of the radiological warfare effort. So yes, Philip Layton was a huge flag. I mean, why would someone like that be involved in this sort of minor study in a city in the Midwest? I mean, that is just so illogical on its face that, I mean, it's a question that needs to be answered right away.
And that was a flag that started you down that path. What did they tell city officials in St. Louis that they would be doing there?
Well, they gave some story that they wanted to conceal the city under a cloud in case of aerial attack by Russia, presumably, which is rather silly because radar existed at the time. And so that doesn't even really make sense in terms of a cover story. But they also printed a cover story in the newspaper about that. And so they absolutely, the Army absolutely attempted to steer people in a different direction in terms of, or shut down any questions about, what was going on. Now, they had done a sort of the pilot event in Minneapolis for the St. Louis experiments. They began it in Minneapolis. They had been a little bit more direct with the community about it. They didn't say anything about this cloud, concealing a city under a cloud. So they'd been a little bit more direct about it. They went door to door. They wore, they put signs on the cars, and they tried to be a little bit more open about it. Well, that backfired because people in the community in Minneapolis said, I don't know what they're doing to us, but we don't like it. They engaged in self-help, and they started tampering with the sample boxes, pulling them off. They had sample boxes, these sort of black boxes that were affixed in different places. And they started tampering with the sample boxes and doing what they could to engage in self-help, meaning stopping their exposure or stopping these experiments in some way. They weren't getting answers. And so they took it upon themselves to address it in the community directly. So because the Army had dealt with this, and this irritated them. When they came to St. Louis, they were even more secretive about the St. Louis experiments, and they didn't tell anyone what was going on. And they did provide a cover story to local leaders, and they did, publish an article that tried to explain it away as being this sort of crazy cloud study, or this crazy, I don't know if it was even considered a study at that point, but this cloud concealment. So,
Wow.
yeah.
And what is your response and reaction when the Army continues to say this was just zinc cadmium sulfide and it was harmless?
Well, first of all, cadmium is not harmless, and it's a suspected carcinogen, a cancer-causing agent. You should never be exposing people. Now, they released over a ton of this material into the environs of St. Louis, over a ton. So, over a ton of any chemical being released into the environment should cause concern to the community. But when you're talking about cadmium or zinc cadmium sulfide, that's of grave concern to the community. And the other thing is that we have to look at this also in terms of context. Part of what the Army did, and the Department of Defense did, was they sort of tried to break this all apart. What I did was I came along and I tried to put it back together, these pieces. But they broke these pieces apart, right? This four-pronged project became very dissimilar in ways that they attempted to make it look dissimilar anyway, so that people wouldn't understand this was a much larger, military project, because it was, highly secretive. And so context mattered. It mattered so deeply in my work. It matters so deeply in our analysis of any piece of this. We can't just look at it in isolation, any one of these things in isolation. And that's part of the problem of why we didn't realize the seriousness of what was happening to various communities around North America, is because it was out of context. When given context, saying we had this four-pronged plan by the United States military to develop offensive weapons, and that they were using these communities to study, or as a precursor to using those weapons, maybe I should say more accurately, that context matters. So we can't look at, zinc alone or cadmium alone, or anything like that, and we can't look at zinc cadmium sulfide alone. We have to look at what else was added to it. If we look at the zinc cadmium sulfide that they used in the St. Louis experiments, for example, we can see that it's not 100% of the sort of parts of that chemical that they used. There were other elements in there that were not identified. And in fact, when we look at, later, the National Research Council came along, and they were looking at the Army documents to see maybe what had happened and what was sprayed under order of Congress. What they found was that they looked at the Army documents, but the Army documents were redacted. They were blanked out. They were, things were omitted. Things were secret. They couldn't find. There were errors, omissions, redactions. They could not find exactly what was part of these experiments. And so when we look at that, and we also see other Army documents that say, well, it wasn't 100% zinc cadmium sulfide, right? It was maybe 85%, or maybe 95%, or maybe 90%. What was in that other 5%? That's what we don't know. That was left unidentified. And that's where context comes in, because we can see, if we look at every other experiment that looked very similar, if we can look at all of these sort of pieces about who was involved in this, the fact that it was that the radiological weapons program was a spinoff of the Manhattan Project, right? And that they wanted to do all these atmosphere studies. They wanted to do these inhalation studies. St. Louis was their chosen city, in fact, to do inhalation studies for radiological weapons. And we see all of these other pieces that fall in place. Context matters. It matters a lot. And that's when we see we have far bigger problems and far bigger questions than wondering, than sort of this one little line of, is zinc cadmium sulfide harmful? It goes well beyond that at that point when you add that context to it.
So you believe that the U.S. government sprayed radioactive material on the city of St. Louis?
I can look to the literature, I can look at all of the research, and I can say there is a glaring gap in terms of what they did spray. So that is not identified by the military. But when we look at all of the things that the military did say about what they wanted to do, what they wanted to test, where they wanted to test it, all of the requirements that they had to do an open air experiment for radiological weapons, an offensive experiment, we can see that they named St. Louis as their chosen city. We can see that in 1953, they had said that they wanted to conduct a large-scale open-air experiment with radiation in 1953. We can see in 1953 that they landed in St. Louis. So, and conducted open-air experiments designed by their, radioactive cloud expert in the Army. So, I mean, there are 1,000 different pieces that I could go on into that I've outlined in my book that continuously point us in this direction of radiological weapons experiments. And so I think with those kinds of pressing questions, do we see a smoking gun? Well, smoking guns are very rare. Usually it's a series of documents that take us down a road to explain, guilt or to bring a legal case forward. And so that's what you have to look at, is the span of documents that provide context to what else was going on in St. Louis. I looked, for example, at the social networks of the people who were involved. What else were they doing? What else were they involved in? Who else did they align with and communicate with? What were those people doing? And so I tracked sort of these social networks also to see these major players, who they knew, what they were doing, what was their work history, what projects were they working on actively during that same window. And so, you end up with a very complex map, if you will, but all of that is related to context, and context becomes hugely significant.
Yeah. And Dr. Martino-Taylor, what do you make of the continued lack of transparency, the continued secrecy? These joint quarterly reports, I know that you've worked to declassify many of them. Joint Quarterly Report 5 is still missing, suspected to be authored by Leighton himself. We picked that up. We tried to FOIA and get that declassified. Constructive denial from the Army. They never replied. They never replied. We submitted our appeal. We are still waiting on that. Are you surprised by that at all? And are you surprised that we do have information about these other egregious cases, the oatmeal experiments? So much information has come to light about the radioactive cocktails given to pregnant women in Tennessee and California. And there are still so many missing pieces and question marks surrounding what was happening in St. Louis.
It's always been on my mind. Why is it that they are willing to admit that they fed children radioactive oatmeal or injected them with radioactive material, or that they gave pregnant women radioactive cocktails knowing that it would cross the placenta and effectively, impact the unborn children? If they're willing to admit that, and they're not willing to declassify all of the secrets from St. Louis, what happened in St. Louis? I mean, it just reinforces that question for me, because that was my initial question. What happened in St. Louis? That sort of opened up this whole ball of yarn, as you called it. So what else happened that we don't know about beyond St. Louis?
Why the secrecy, do you think? Is it a national security issue? Do you think there's still a national security risk by disclosing all that information? Is it the scale?
Well, there are some estimates that over 100,000 were affected or exposed in some way. So we're talking about a lot of numbers all across North America. And so when we think about that, I think that it becomes less a matter of I'm sensitive to national security things. I do, military research in effect, right? And so I'm very sensitive to the need to balance in society, the need for secrecy at times versus the need for transparency. And I'm very sensitive to that and very aware of sort of where that line is based on, a lot of the research that I've done. I understand that documents do need to remain classified. And when I see, for example, documents that are declassified that I think maybe shouldn't be, I'm a little troubled by that, I must say. So I do realize that there's a line, and I very much appreciate that line, and I think that line is there for a reason. Why they would continue to keep documents secret, I think, has a lot more to do with embarrassment and scope. The scope of the the projects that they engaged in. Many of these people are sort of some have died that were involved in these experiments, and maybe some are still around, but maybe it's still so fresh that there is a deep sense of knowing that something happened that shouldn't have happened to a lot of Americans being targeted. It could be a sense of, this is, not something that the military structure itself wants to share, because that, even though the players may be deceased, it does reflect upon the military and maybe adds distrust. And we need to have faith and trust in our institutions, and that is very important to have. So there are a balance of things that could be going on there. But I would say, given what I have seen, that probably the most significant reason would be avoiding embarrassment.
There's a ticking clock on this story as well. There was one woman who I was supposed to speak with, and we didn't get there in time. She already passed away by the time our crew got on the ground, suffering deeply with multiple cancers. We spoke to her daughter instead. The residents told me that they feel that the government is waiting them out, and that soon there will be no one left who was alive when this happened.
I understand why they would feel that way. There was great deceit. And because of that deceit, where, people believe that they were harmed directly through the actions of others and then deceived and then lied to, and then it was, kept from them, the information was kept from them, then that, does affect your sense of, I can realize justice, at least I can realize justice, that there's always that, there's always that we have to rely on. When that's removed and you feel like there is no recourse in terms of, lawsuits or, because we do have avenues of recourse in this country. Then, I could see how people would lose hope in this. I hope they continue. I mean, they are the sort of forward-facing story here. They are central. Everybody who has been through this, their stories are all important, significant, valued, and they are carrying our history on their backs. And I think that they certainly deserve to be heard. They deserve enormous amount of respect, and to have to carry the story on their backs on top of being targeted in this way and deceived in this way. That's asking a lot of people.
Yeah. I want to ask you a complicated question. Since the story aired, as I mentioned, it has really resonated and blown up in a big way. 1.5 million views, as I said, just on YouTube of one part of that investigation. Countless others. And all of these comments pouring in from viewers along the lines of that they can only imagine what is continuing to happen today that we don't know about. Having extreme distrust towards our government, towards science and scientists, saying things like, why would I ever get a vaccine again after hearing about what the government did? Does that concern you? And is that the message that you want people to walk away with from your body of research, from your work, and from the investigation in St. Louis?
That is a tough question. I think that my examination of this sort of crucial part of our history that's really been in the shadows for too long really does speak to the need to have safeguards in society. Now, there were safeguards. There were legal safeguards at that time, and there are legal safeguards likewise now. Maybe we need more of those safeguards. Maybe we need more transparency. Maybe we need, other sort of tools that take us into, being more of a democracy, maybe prioritizing being more of that. I do think that the danger of what Fred Emil Katz, another sociologist, referred to as a closed moral universe is very real. And that means when, a group of people, in this case, the people working on the Manhattan Project, and then the spin-off project, which also involves some of the same people, when they are working in sort of this closed world, impervious to any sort of external opinions or external research or outside input, if you will, then we see that there can be a very easy shift from someone who goes from a healthcare provider to someone who goes to looking at their patients now as test subjects rather than a patient. And so we have sort of this human line there, and for us to, it's really urgent, I think, for us to understand that shift of how can our good neighbors, good community members, good people who help other people who seem kind and nice and do all these wonderful things in the community, how is it that they can in their job engage in something that's so harmful to the community? Those are questions of the day, I think. These are questions that will forever be around and should be asked by people like me, a sociologist who, is wondering how we can so easily make that shift. To me, that's the lesson, some of the lesson here. It is a central lesson here in terms of, the dangers of a closed moral universe, the dangers of secrecy, the dangers of lack of transparency despite legal safeguards, again, that were in place then and are here. That this program sort of superseded every, I don't want to say rational thought, but every human, bit of compassion there. I have problems when I see those shifts going on.
It seems to me that we need to be very careful of moments in time and moments in history when the ends seem to justify the means. When there is an existential threat, like during the Cold War, when the Soviet threat was so pressing and so real that it somehow, as you said, superseded the threshold of humanity in people and allowed them to do monstrous things to innocent people. Are you concerned that history can repeat itself and we can easily come back to a situation where it feels urgent and pressing and the ends suddenly justify the means? Are you concerned that we may be entering into a period like that again now?
I'm always concerned when I see these closed moral universes sort of tighten and drift apart.
And tell me more
I
what
think
you
it's
mean by that for any listeners who are not familiar with that term, closed moral universe.
sure that's a term coined by Fred Katz, who's another sociologist who actually was a Holocaust survivor. And he talked about closed moral universes where we can have sort of this tight circle, whether it's people who work in a, particular place or, whatever it is, these sort of tight, because we all belong to groups, a bunch of different groups, right? These tight circles that we have that are kind of impervious to any external input, different perspectives, for example, right? Sort of lacking the compassion to understand how do you understand someone else's point of view, right? If those scientists, those doctors turned scientists, turned military people, had, maybe asked themselves, well, put themselves in someone else's shoes and said, well, would we want this happening to us as a child or to our children? And getting sort of feedback from the community about whether they think that's an appropriate set of experiments, right? There's a reason why secrecy is there, and that is to keep that closed moral universe, to prevent that external feedback from coming in and entering and making people say, wait a minute, what am I thinking? Why would I do that? that actually is against my values. Right. And so
Yeah.
it sort of opens up, it cracks open people into, remembering what their personal values are, or remembering what it's like maybe to be in someone else's shoes, or somehow connecting to their humanity there. Um, those, those are really essential sort of elements to preventing these kinds of things. And I think that, in a climate where you have these sort of groups that are really constricted and constrained, and really sort of refusing external points of view from coming in, and refusing to be, to understand someone else's perspective or to have empathy, those kinds of things become kind of dangerous in that
Yeah.
regard, because they're not getting that external input that makes us think about how someone else might view it, and whether or not we are actually being true to our own actual values.
It's so worrisome because I think about the moment in which we find ourselves online, and the echo chambers that can so easily form on social media, and the way people can just get continually sucked down a very narrow universe and point of view, and dogma and doctrine. Such polarization taking place that it's not just, it's no longer just not agreeing with another person's point of view, but actually condemning that other person as evil. Um, and all of these conditions seem ripe for what you're talking about. And it makes me worried. Um, it makes me genuinely worried. I want to circle back. If someone walks away from reading your book, from looking at this research, and says, I will never trust the institution, I will never trust science, I will never trust scientists again. Is that the takeaway that you want people to be walking away from this information with?
I will address that, but I want to say one other thing, if I could.
Sure.
There was another element in regard to these experiments that was also pretty significant. It was also significant in the Manhattan Project as well. There's also that measure of status. And so these were largely young men who were, I think the average age was 25 or something in the Manhattan Project. Largely young men who had multiple degrees, who were looking at this as working with some of the brightest minds in the world. And they were looking at this also as a way to achieve status and recognition within that closed group. Now, that's what's key here, is within that closed group. So would the, outside world, would, various universities look at those kinds of experiments as being, something that qualifies someone to have status, or, that would move them up the ranks in any way? Maybe not. Maybe not. So when we look at that closed world, there can be some really powerful and enticing forces that go on there, where people want to prove themselves within that closed world, right? To the people who are maybe more senior than them or whatever. And they have the skills to do it. And they had open season to be able to use their knowledge to think, okay, what is my dream? What is my dream to do? I have open license to be able to do that now. What do you think? I'm going to go for it. And without any external guardrails to them for doing that. And so there were a combination of things that were sort of working together there that created this sort of mix where this could happen.
Okay. I appreciate you saying that. What is the other part that you wanted to address?
I deeply feel, as a sociologist, that our institutions are foundational. They're the glue that keeps society together. We must trust our institutions. Now, that said, we are, we the people here. So our institutions are us, and they reflect us. And so, we need to be involved in making sure that we have laws that are protective of us, that we learn from these kinds of, historical events that didn't quite land or go the way we feel are in line with our collective values. We have a lot of shared collective values that are quite aligned in this country. And so, we have to work. We all have a role to play here. This isn't just, I do the research and whatever. This is all of our story, right? We all have a different role to play here. And so we have to build those safeguards, to make sure. We have to do what we can to advance democracy. We have to make sure that we're doing what we can to make sure that secrecy is legitimately needed, and that otherwise we need to maximize transparency.
Yeah.
And so we have to say so in that. Our Constitution is designed that way, that we all play a role here in this. And so I don't think it's a matter of, do I just shut down and not trust institutions? No, we make better institutions that work better for us. That's our job in this, right? We all have a job here. So that's what I think. I think it's it's not helpful for us to just move forward and distrust. I think that, no, you take the next step, which is, okay, what do you do if you don't trust an institution? You rebuild it, or you enhance it, or you put up, safeguards, or you eliminate something that's not working for us now, or you do whatever it is that you have to do to improve on that. We have a basic structure that was built particularly in the United States that prioritizes us, the people, we the people. And so it's for us to do better. It's for us to build.
I want to address a viewer question that came up over and over again, which is, how do we know that human experimentation is not continuing at the hands of the U.S. government today? Do you have any thoughts surrounding that question?
Well, all I can say, because I haven't looked into that, so I can't answer definitively on that. But all I can say is that, like today, legal safeguards were in place at that time. So we had protections. Were they good enough? Obviously not. Obviously not. Should we build on those protections? Should we throw them out? What should we do? Well, you don't throw out protections. You build on those. And so you need, obviously, tighter protections for people. And again, that's about working towards a greater democracy, working towards greater safeguards for people, stronger laws, much more transparency, et cetera, as far as you can take that, while guarding the legitimate secrets. So, I can't specifically answer that. I know that there are dangers to secrecy, and there is a lot of secrecy still. So, that needs to be addressed by us. And there are dangers, real dangers, as we talked about, to these closed groups, these local moral universes, where people are not getting perspective, outside perspective, and integrating that into their decisions, into their actions, right? That's so important. And so, those are sort of dangerous things that I think are out there that need to be improved on, worked on, fought for, so that this doesn't happen again. So I think that's as best as I can answer that question.
I appreciate that. Let's return to this moment in time when so far you've been looking at what seem to be disparate cases of experimentation, and you realize that actually you believe it was part of a broader project. Specifically, you say that these experiments were not isolated events, but part of a national offensive weapons program that was spun out of the Manhattan Project. Can you describe what you discovered?
Right. So, I was looking at a lot of different, experiments, if you will, with radioactive material. And as I went through, patterns started to emerge in that research, and it became pretty clear. It snowballed. So it actually pretty quickly, once it started opening up, it snowballed pretty quickly. It became clear that there was a radiological weapons program. Now, after more digging, it became very clear from looking at military documents, both that I had declassified and that were out there and available, that this was an offensive program. They were talking in terms of weapons to use to target certain groups in the world. And when you look at the experiments themselves, they're not necessarily looking at, well, what are the what are the effects in this community? It's much more broad than that. And so we see ultimately that they're not just trying to develop radiological weapons, but they're also trying to, beyond that, develop combination weapons. And so combination weapons combine radiological weapons with chemical weapons, or radiological weapons with biological weapons. So you do one and then you do the next. And so they were sort of going down that road, later on. And so that was their ultimate weapon system. Radiological weapons, so it's important to note, very different from atomic bombs. And this is the sort of harder thing, I think, to wrap your head around. At least it was for me anyway. And that is, these do not involve detonation. This is not a bomb that explodes. This is using radioactive material in some way as a weapon. So contaminating water or injecting someone, right? Because these are the lines that they were going down. Food, contaminating food, etc. Inhalation. And so they had these four-pronged weapons testing programs, and they were looking at dissemination and effect and how do you measure dissemination. So they're looking at machines that could measure the dissemination of certain materials, etc. Now, the reason why they wanted to do this, and this is really crucial, I think, is that the atomic weapons project, the Manhattan Project, was a pretty slow go. They had other brightest minds working on this, doing what they can, but they were trying to process, uranium. They were doing all of these things. It was a multi-step process, and it was excruciatingly long for people who wanted to have a weapon developed now. So what they realized at a certain point was, and Robert Oppenheimer was involved in this, his role in this was quite troubling. He was advocating for radiological weapons in terms of ingestion. He was absolutely, talking about how many people can we kill by poisoning water. So he was very involved in this. When we look at what they were saying, they were talking about this timeline was really bothering them. How can we shorten the timeline in getting this done and having this weapon in hand? And, at some point they started having this discussion about, well, what if we took the radioactive material itself that was being produced through cyclotrons, so it was being produced, this isn't naturally occurring, but the produced material that was radioactive, and we used that as a weapon itself without taking it to the next step of sending it to Los Alamos and putting it through the rest of the processing. And so what if we just took that material? Then we'd have a weapon, we'd cut 9 months off of our work. So that's how this came to be. It was this sort of troublingly pragmatic decision making that we all kind of go through at work. And when we think of it as these are people who are doing a job, we can see how that might happen, right? How do we shorten this timeline? Well, we can do this. And so that's sort of how it unfolded. And then it started taking off from there. They started testing animals with inhalation. They started doing the injection studies. The inhalation came a little bit later, but the ingestion studies, of course, came into starting with animals at Los Alamos and then so on. Then they moved out into the population. And this was ultimately part of a tripartite agreement that also involved Canada and England.
Yeah, tell me more about that, because in terms of the spraying experiments, it wasn't just St. Louis. Can you talk to me more about Operation Large Area Coverage and how many other sites had a zinc cadmium sulfide at the very least sprayed on them?
So Operation Large Area Coverage, Operation LAC, is a completely different project. That's a completely separate and different project. One big difference, one way that you can tell sort of how it's distinct, is that the St. Louis experiments were quite unique in that they were on the ground. They were ground level experiments. So they went as far as rooftop, not maybe 3 stories, not significantly high, 2 stories, 3 stories, but largely they were on the ground. So they would put machinery on the back of trucks or station wagons and drive through neighborhoods, essentially spraying this material. And then they had these black boxes that would measure the amount that was dispersed. Those were all over the area. I had one individual who'd kept records for decades over the spring in St. Louis. She found it so deeply disturbing. She would run around her house and slam the windows shut because her kids were sleeping in bed, and it was largely happening at night. And she said that there was a black box that had been tossed in the bushes in front of her house. When we look at sort of ground level stuff, this is, permeating on the ground, inside businesses, inside homes, a well-populated area. And people at the time were sleeping with their windows open because there was no air conditioning in St. Louis. And St. Louis is largely, brick buildings, and so it holds in that heat, and it's a hot place in the summer, hot and humid, and so people would sleep in the park or sleep out on their porch, their open porch, and or certainly sleep with their windows open. And so so we can see that when it's ground level and targeting the buildings, and the question I think that they were looking at, one of the questions was, how does this material move in and around buildings? That was one of their questions in terms of the Army that they were looking at. How does it move in between buildings and around buildings? And how does the wind take it, and move it, down the street? We can see that that's particularly egregious when you're looking at large area coverage, which is still not okay, still deeply troubling, not wanted, I would say. That was by planes overhead, so a much higher atmospheric level. What I've been doing is looking at sort of the four corners of the radiological weapons program, and then so where that was headed, which is the combination weapons program. So large area coverage happened. It's absolutely concerning. It absolutely should be looked into. I published another article about someone who was involved, who had been assigned by the Air Force to spray over Texas and to disperse material, and he found that his tank on his plane had been changed, and so we asked what was in the tank, the replacement tank, and they threw him in the brig for it. They arrested him for it.
Wow.
So, questions are not, you don't question the closed moral universe. But when I look at that, I think, okay, that to me sounds like biological weapons, potentially chemical weapons. I lean towards biological weapons just because of some of the things that I've read that where I see biological agents were sprayed above communities in St. Louis. But again, that is outside of the scope of the radiological weapons program, which had never been talked about to my knowledge. It was encoded in the military documents, and so therefore it wasn't really ever discussed anywhere. And so I was trying to sort of piece together, okay, what did that program look like? What did they want to do? Why were they doing it? Was it a defensive program? All of these things. No, it was an offensive program. It was really to they were looking straight at Moscow in terms of ultimate use. And so there were a lot of questions that I had to answer, and that just is one that the lack and those air spraying experiments, those are just outside the scope of what I was looking at here. Certainly something of interest to me, though, because I have written about that.
Okay, I appreciate that distinction. So returning then to your research, what was the ultimate goal of combining radioactive with chemical or biological agents, and why the secrecy here? Why was the level of secrecy so extraordinary?
So the ultimate goal was to develop a combination weapon, which means that you would combine in some way, various ways, radiological material, so radioactive material, with either a chemical weapon or a biological weapon. And they were doing experiments of all of these things, right? And so we can see where ultimately they wanted to bring them together and create this weapon. The reason is complex, just like all the rest of this is complex. And that is that they were looking at, so they might have different approaches, in other words. So, for example, were they going into an urban area, or were they interested in a rural area? These distinctions matter to them, right? They might use a chemical weapon and a radiological weapon in and I'm just speculating here, in a rural area versus, you know, radiological and some other combination. And it just depended on what they were trying to do. Were they trying to clear out a neighborhood, or were they trying to make a neighborhood so toxic that no one would ever want to come back in, right? Was it a military facility that they didn't want anyone to ever re-enter or at risk of death? And they would use a radiological weapon and maybe combine that with some other type of weapon to get people to disperse quickly, right? And then not want to come back in. So there are different sort of reasons why they would have utilized different types of weapons. And so they were looking at all of these things. And so it's sort of a mix-up, if you will, based on what was their objective during that particular sort of run, if you will. Does that make
And
sense?
it does make sense. And you've said that this program is the story that has never been told. Tell me more about that.
So we do know about the Manhattan Project, right? I mean, we've seen, you know, books written about this, and we've analyzed it, and we know a lot about that. We don't know everything about that, but we know a lot about it. But if we, you know, dig more, which ultimately I didn't begin doing that, but ultimately that's where I ended up. We can see the discussions in the literature about developing different types of weapons that most people, when they hear radiation, they just automatically think atomic bomb, right? But we have to sort of break from that and understand that they wanted to develop this other shorter timeline that would have a pretty devastating ultimate effect, right? That was effective. That's their job, right? To develop effective weapons. So when we think about that in terms of, you know, this radioactive material being developed itself as a weapon, which is very distinct, completely distinct from the atomic bomb project, then we can understand that we might miss a lot of things in the literature when we're going through it and we're trying to understand weapon systems if we don't even know that the radiological weapons program exists, right? We don't know what to look for. It's hidden in plain sight, because the language is ambiguous enough where your automatic thinking is atomic bomb if it says something about radiation. If you don't know that this other program exists, then you're going to think it's just more about nuclear weapons or the atomic bomb. So it's hidden in plain sight in that way. And then there was also some encoding that they used, which they also used for the atomic bomb project, for the Manhattan Project. They did encode for that one as well. So this wasn't new. But in this way, they ensured that the secrecy would be preserved for this program. I don't think it was ever their intention that this would see the light of day.
Mm. So what do you see as your unique contribution in terms of connecting the dots here?
Well, I would say one big part of it is I declassified a whole lot of documents that are now in the public domain for journalists or for, you know, concerned citizens or for anybody, for scholars to access. They can now access those. But also what I did was I looked through, you know, journalistic reports. I looked through scientific, published scientific studies. I looked through, of course, a lot of military documents. I looked through really anything I could get my hands on that I thought might have information connected to this to try to make sense of it. And probably the most surprising thing to me was just the scope of this, that as I looked, I just kept finding more and more and more. And that was just so surprising to me, shocking to me, that this just became a larger and larger project, and one that they maintained their secrecy in such a sort of thin veneer almost, because it was confused with the atomic bomb project, because it was embedded. These experiments were often embedded into legitimate experiments. You know, if you're going to test, you know, how does, flour move through the air, or how does air pollution move through the air, right? And you just interject a little bit of, some airborne material that's been refined into a dust to be, inhale deep into the lungs, and you don't know that, right? You might even be doing part of that experiment yourself as a worker, an hourly worker. We did see that too. Then what we can see is these experiments could take place sort of right out in the open with people not having any idea what they are. And so they embedded a lot of these experiments into legitimate experiments, and that created a cover for them. And they indemnified military contractors from any responsibility. And they pulled in the public health service and said, Truman said, we need you to assist on radiological weapons experiments testing. And so it gave them cover to do studies that looked like they were just in the interest of the public health, but in fact, they were working in cohesion and in partnership with the Army Chemical Corps on radiological weapons experiments. So they were able to embed these studies in legitimate studies that people would ordinarily think, oh, they're helping us, or it seems, like it's a positive thing, or, that it's in the public interest. But what a turn can happen so quickly from public interest into using people as test subjects without their informed consent.
Wow. Every time you describe these layers of secrecy and how you almost became like a code breaker when looking at many of these declassified documents, because they're never going to come out and say, oh, yes, this, the plutonium, the radioactive material, it's always the product. It's something else. And just so I can synthesize this for myself, because, we were looking at almost 2 decades of research of yours, and we're trying to synthesize it down into a way that people can understand. I'm looking at your book, and I'm looking at page 13, and it talks about identifying the second secret research arm of the Manhattan Project, the development of the radiological weapons, RW, through 3 pathways: injection, ingestion, and inhalation. This is, during the Cold War, when the Soviet threat is at its highest. And this is branching off of the Manhattan Project. And we are not looking at radiation the way that we usually think about it, like an atomic bomb, an actual explosion and a scatter of radiation from a bomb. We're looking at radiological weapons. We're seeing a pattern of experimentation, you say. Injection, ingestion, and inhalation, which encompasses the oatmeal experiments. It encompasses what was happening to pregnant women. It encompasses, you believe, what was happening in St. Louis. That's what your research shows as well, potentially. And that the ultimate goal here was to create an offensive weapon to be used potentially against the enemy that combined radiation, a radioactive component, with biological agents and chemical agents as well. Do I have that correct?
That's correct. That's a combination weapon. Yeah, and they talked about combination weapons in their, documents, and about how that was that was the next step for them. That was the thing that was of interest next. But they couldn't do that until they had sort of nailed down the, for example, they had a question that was, what radioactive material do we use? Do we use this? Do we try this? Do we try this? And does it depend on sort of feet from the ground, or upper atmosphere, lower atmosphere? All of these things. They were looking at, hundreds of different questions.
Can I ask, where did
Sure.
all of this end up leading? Did we ever find out in the research, did they ever end up creating some sort of super radiological, biological, chemical combination weapon? Or what ended up happening with all of this data and all this research and information?
That's a great question that needs to be answered. What did happen? We're talking about, then we entered the Cold War, right? After World War II, we entered the Cold War and détente. And so my sense of it, although I can't point to anything in the literature, anything in documents that say it, my sense of it is that it just sort of lingered as it was. And whether they picked that up and ran with it later, I don't know. But we were in a moment of détente where everything was on hold. And I would think that our military leaders would honor that agreement, and do the same. So I don't know is the answer to that question, but it's certainly something worth exploring.
You know, it was so interesting. We reached out and asked the Army for statement. They gave us basically a one-pager, and when we asked point blank, was there any radiological component to the spray in St. Louis? Um, it struck me they did not just say no. They ended up saying none of the reports found evidence of any sort of radiological component to the spraying. And then when you actually look at the National Research Council's report, their review and what they ended up saying, they said that, you know, they looked at the issue of zinc cadmium sulfide to the best of their ability. But when they asked the Army for certain key records and data and information, the Army replied that either a lot of key information was still classified because of national security, or it was missing and they couldn't find it. What do you make of that?
I'm not surprised at all. Also, other records that they looked at, they had, um, virtually pages that were redacted where it was just completely blanked out. They had omitted data, they had deleted data, there were times when, they were doing some of these experiments and they would turn, like the machine off that measured output. They would turn things off or they wouldn't document it. They left things purposely blank. I mean, there's a lot of that going on here and at every step of the way. There was a lot of secrecy, and it's interesting. I mean, they kept the documents locked up actually in Minneapolis, even though when St. Louis studies were conducted, they kept the data locked up under lock and key in a locked room under lock and key. So double or triple locks in Minneapolis, a different city altogether. So it's interesting. It's very hard to sort of pull that apart and. You know, NRC did its best maybe with what they had, but they didn't seem to have very much.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to sort of get to that point when all you have is what you have in terms of analyzing data, and then you have to come to some conclusion because this is a study that was ordered by Congress, and so they had to have findings. Now, do findings include questions like, well, we wonder if this happened or if that happened, or we can't fill in this, and there's only so much that they could do. So I just think it's a start, but it's a very weak start in terms of, the data that they include there. But it does include some data for other cities that we haven't seen before. It does include LAC data, for example, large area coverage data that we haven't seen before. So, but it's also it's very much in disarray. If you look at the published study, it's very unusual how it's written and assembled. It's not very cohesive. There's not even an index to it. So it's very hard to use in terms of finding data. You really do have to almost memorize it.
If you could give a piece of advice to the next wave of journalists and researchers coming up who want to follow these trails and continue this line of questioning in your research, what would that advice be?
Be dogged. Don't give up. Don't accept no for an answer. If they deny you documents, appeal them. Craft the best legal appeal that you can, and ask again. Try to find allies in terms of people who are members of the community or scholars or people who work in these agencies that are sort of the gatekeepers of these documents, and because it bothers them too. I guarantee you that there are people there who also have questions once they sort of get wind of this or what you're asking, and that they too want to know the answers, and that they would like to see, some degree. I mean, these people are people who value information, right? Archivists value information. They preserve information. They preserve our history. So it's very important to them that our history is tapped in, that we utilize these documents. And so, our libraries are significantly important. Our archives are significantly important. This is what holds our history, and we must guard that history so that we can access it and understand sort of our collective past. I mean, our collective past creates who we are today. And so we're all connected to this.
Is there one specific thought or message that you want us to consider after this conversation?
I think the thing that stands out most to me in terms of the largest question here would be, how is it that professionals who are sworn to the public good can so easily lose their way and end up doing something quite egregious that is not at all in line with their initial value system? And I think that it's really important for all of us to be revisiting our value system, and maybe constantly, maybe, every now and then. But we are often asked to do things that don't align with our personal values. And a lot of times that's related to a job or career or something. We might be asked to set those aside for a day or 3 years or however long. But I would say that that's the most important time when we're asked to do that, to look back into our value system, to open the door, get different perspectives from people who may not be like us, and to see, is that in line with our value system? And if it is not, then don't do it.
Thank you so much. What a privilege, what a pleasure again for me to get to speak with you. Again, your book is Behind the Fog: How the U.S. Cold War Radiological Weapons Program Exposed Innocent Americans. Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening and watching. This podcast was put together by Ryan Kerr, Mia Balbin-Cuesta, Ali Purser, and me, Natasha Zouves. And a quick reminder, you can listen to The Truth of the Matter with Natasha Zouves wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.